We often hear from critics of that of capitalism and the free market on that of the wealth gap. Have a listen to this argument.
A free market is supposed to be a good thing, and it's sold to us by many as if it is. The Heritage Foundation publishes something called the Free Market Index with the top freest societies in the world. On the top, we consistently see Hong Kong and Singapore. So, free market advocates would point to these two nations as something to be replicated. And yes, on the surface, Singapore and Hong Kong are very, very rich nations. But much of the wealth is only going to a few of the inhabitants.
What he ignores is the fact that if you were to look at both Hong Kong and Singapore of even the late 1940s or early 1950s, you will find both of these cities, which, Hong Kong was a tiny small fishing village at that time, the size of nothing. It was living in extreme poverty. Everybody was worse off. And yet, if you were to look at Hong Kong and Singapore today, Singapore's the richest city in the world. Hong Kong is arguably one of the richest cities in the world. Both are richer than that of the United States of America today and even Great Britain. Their average household income is just unbelievable compared to what it was decades ago in the early 1950s.
As these city-states have among the worst income inequalities in the world.
What he's really basically saying is he's not interested in that improvement. He doesn't pay attention to the very fact that the poor, the bottom 20% today, in the likes of Hong Kong and Singapore, are far richer today than what they were in the 1950s. So he's not interested in that real world improvement. Another thing to point out, and I've mentioned this before, when you talk about the wealth gap, the bottom 20% today is not the same bottom 20% a decade ago or a decade before that. Over a time period, the bottom 20% changes. It's not fixed. That is to say, it's not the same people. That's because what happens over decades is that the bottom 20% changes as people move up the ladder. He just does not pay attention to that of the dramatic improvement in their living standards, in their wealth, but most importantly, he ignores the very difference between Hong Kong, after 1997 to before 97. That is to say, the government's intervention. Remember, the lease came to an end in 97 when Great Britain, their rulership was given over to that of China, and there was a difference. There became an impact on Hong Kong through the government intervention. As I mentioned in a video before, you can check that video out where I mentioned about the housing crisis. He doesn't point out the very difference between Hong Kong's market before 97 to after 97. Let's just go on with what he has to say.
Take Singapore. While being a free market, it has somewhat of a pseudo-welfare state. For some reason, the government had to step in and provide housing for 80% of the population. Most of the population live in government-funded, low-cost homes. The free market has only provided for 20% of the population.
Again, it's this idea that just because Singapore's government owns 80% of the housing, that somehow this has something to do with why Singapore is better off today. No one would go as far as to say that Singapore is this truly, free market based economy. I wouldn't even point to Singapore and say that they are this, example of a free market. A free market is that of prices being set freely in the marketplace. It's to do with that of interest rates being set freely in the marketplace in the absence of central banks. Again, does Singapore have true free market money? These are issues you have to look at. Another thing you have to consider is that the word free is not fixed. Now, socialists have a very, very difficult time understanding the very fact that the word free is not fixed. It's a scalable word. That is to say that on the scale, some economies are freer than other economies. Therefore, it's not a case of looking at the word free in black and white and saying, okay, there's no free market because, oh, the word free has to be exactly this or it's not free. In other words, just because government owns 80% of the housing means absolutely nothing. In other words, what the hell did government ownership of housing have to do with that of the improvement of Singapore's wages? Absolutely nothing. What did it have to do with that of money coming in and out of the country in order for Singapore to dramatically improve the average household income of that of the Singaporean people? Absolutely nothing. It's not as simple as saying, oh well, there's government intervention here, there, and that, and this, that, and the next thing, and saying, well, it's because government. Well, if that's the case, then how come if you were to turn your attention to that of Hong Kong before 1997, where they had extremely low levels of government regulation, they were extremely limited with regards to the British government, it was extremely limited to what it could do in Hong Kong. This was an economy that thrived and prospered, much like Singapore, where it had extremely low levels of government regulation and practically had no natural resources, yet despite the fact it could not trade through the border of China, with a tiny small fishing village, how the hell did its average household income dramatically improve right up to the year of 1997? Now yes, of course, there was gradual government intervention, especially since the 1980s. Some people, and my friend Mike could mention himself the problem with that of Margaret Thatcher. Again, she wasn't exactly perfect, and I understand that. It doesn't hide the fact, however, there was dramatic improvement, and that didn't come about because of government. Because if that's the case, if you were to look away from Singapore and Hong Kong and look at that of economies of extreme government intervention on the opposite end of the Freedom Index, you will find that the more and more government intervention you see, the worse off their economies are. You only have to turn your attention to that of, the difference between Sweden before 1960 to after the 1960s. It was because of government's regulation, higher tax rates, the subsidies, etc., the big welfare state. It was because of all of that basically harmed their economy. So what I'm saying to you is, it's not as black and white as saying, well, there's a welfare state and, well, there's, government ownership of housing and leasing of property, therefore this is the reason for why Singapore are better off. It doesn't look at the economy as a whole. It doesn't analyse what parts of the economy are the reason for the improvement of the wages, or why they're better off. It doesn't even question the very fact that, is it valuable for government to own 80% of the housing? What effect would that have if you removed the government ownership of housing? Is that really going to affect the market at all? And if so, why? He doesn't look at that, however. Let's just go on with his argument.
The incomes in Singapore have stagnated or fallen at the bottom of the spectrum as the rich pull further ahead of the middle classes. Much of Singapore's economy is on the backs of foreign migrant workers, who sometimes aren't even protected by labor laws. This is highlighted in the case of maid services. So, a service which is based purely on a free market without any type of government oversight.
Again, what he completely ignores is the government's intervention over a sustainable period of time. But if you were to compare the poorest of society in the likes of Hong Kong and Singapore in 1950 to that of what they're living like today, their wages had dramatically improved. So he talks about, wages having become stagnant. I would love for him to point out that evidence, because this was the same argument they used in the United States of America. And the truth is, the wages have not become stagnant. There's been a continual improvement of wages over the years. So it's a very bold claim that he's made to say that the wages have become stagnant, because how they judge it, they look at the bottom 20% and they look at it as something fixed, as I mentioned earlier on. So the way their mind works is like this. the bottom 20% in 1970 is the same bottom 20% in 2010. That's how their mind works. They don't look at the bottom 20% as anything different. They think the bottom 20% is something fixed. They don't realise that every single decade, that bottom 20% is not the same people. It changes over time. For example, in 1975 to 1991, the bottom 20% moved up the ladder into the middle class and the rich, and they grew richer. So that the rich grew richer and the poor grew richer faster in that period, and they moved up the ladder into the middle class, and that is what's been happening for decades. Sure, things are not exactly perfect, and I would agree that there could be improvements made to that of the likes of Singapore's economy, etc. He's not really interested, as I say, on the poor becoming richer. He's not interested because that's been a definite fact, by the way. The bottom, 20% and over the decades, not just that, but just in general, the poor of society. If you were to look at Singapore again in 1950, everyone was living in extreme poverty. Now, Singapore is a richer city than the United States of America. Again, he's not interested on the fact that the poor are getting richer. He's only interested in the gap between the rich and poor. To me, what does it matter? Who cares if the rich are getting richer or the rich are earning more than the poor per year? I'm not interested. What I'm interested in is the poor getting richer. And that's what I mean, because these are the same people who try to call you greedy, yet these same people can't see green cheese without having a bit.
And the idea that a free market creates freedom also in political rights is immediately debunked by the Singaporean example. The government suppresses freedom of speech quite extensively in order to maintain their hold on power.
Singapore's restrictions on freedom of assembly are very draconian. Any cause-related gathering, no matter how small, requires a police permit, which is rarely ever granted. The only place people are allowed to assemble somewhat freely is a very small section of a very small park in one place in Singapore.
And even this argument is erroneous, because you would not look at the likes of Singapore as some true example of this idea of a free market, and then to say, oh well, the Singapore government, restricts the freedom of speech and respects individuals' rights, and therefore this is a free market. It doesn't work like that, and that most certainly is not the case. That's a bit like saying, well, Hong Kong has a fiat currency, and so does Singapore, and they have central banks, therefore this is the free market. No, a free market, in its truer form, does not have the presence of a central banking system. It does not have a fiat currency. It has that of true money, like that of gold and silver, etc., or whatever the money that people choose to exchange with. The freedom of the marketplace, the freedom to regulate itself. Or for example, and this is the contradictory part, because he admitted that there was 80% government housing in Singapore. The free market would be left to, regulate itself and for the market itself to build housing. Therefore, land would be private and the property would not be leased by that of government. Therefore, when you talk about a free market, it's about defending individuals' rights, the natural right to freedom of speech. So essentially, when it comes to the Singaporean government, they're not respecting their individual natural rights. So it's not exactly this true example of a free market.
Hong Kong is quite a famous nation. It was split from its homeland by imperialism, and the remnants of imperialism still remain today, as it's an autonomous zone which runs on whatever principles the government decides, and they've chosen free market principles. As a result, the income inequality is among the worst in the world, and 20% of the inhabitants live in poverty. That's 1/5 of the entire population. The poorest in Hong Kong are getting poorer. but those in the top income bracket are getting richer, mainly from rental income, dividends, and capital gains. Roughly 10% of Hong Kong residents have 1 million Hong Kong dollars or more in investable liquid assets. In contrast, 20% live below the poverty line of 3,800 Hong Kong dollars per month per person.
If you were to analyse Hong Kong from 1950 onwards, even right up to 2010, you will find the poor has actually been growing richer steadily. Maybe not as much as it was, prior to 1975. It doesn't change the fact, however, that the poor were growing richer each decade. He doesn't concentrate on that fact. All he's interested in, again, is really all down to what the rich are earning.
Upward social mobility is difficult in Hong Kong, where elite preschool pupils have curriculum portfolios and the rich grab more university places.
You notice how he's not interested in the fact that their material standards of living is better off today than what it was in the 1950s? You can go and check out the video for yourself where I did mention there's a problem even in housing, and it's all to do with the laws of supply and demand, and that's a very big problem that you see. The government did cause a very big problem with regards to an immigration crisis in Hong Kong, but you would blame that on government, not on the free market. Again, you can check that video out for yourself and you can see of what I'm talking about. It's all to do with the laws of supply and demand. That's not to do with that of the free market's fault.
The conditions of the impoverished in Hong Kong are absolutely horrid. Many of them live in extremely small spaces. Some cases, they live in literal cages.
Actually, in Hong Kong, we have two worlds in one city. I think it's just like you go to another world.
Again, folk, I've been through that argument and I've explained about caged housing. Before 1997, the caged housing was rapidly in decline. Again, go check the video out for yourself. I already explained all that and I'm not going to go into detail on that here. So if you want to see on what I explained about caged housing and stuff like that, go check it out for yourself, and I even mentioned about the Kowloon walled city that explains all of that.
Some claim that this isn't real poverty, because Hong Kong only has relative poverty. This fails to understand what purchasing power parity is. The cost of living is extremely high in Hong Kong, so relative poverty is just as good as the World Bank's estimate of absolute poverty. Would anyone really call these conditions not true poverty? The poor in these nations aren't poor because the nation has too little wealth, such as the case with most impoverished nations, but because the rich simply want to take as much as they possibly can, and the free market allows them to do so.
He basically tries to brush under the carpet the importance of absolute poverty and only looks at that of relative poverty. You only need to look at that of the average household income and the average people of society living in Hong Kong in the 1950s, where it was one of the poorest places on planet Earth. And if you look at the average poor person of today in Hong Kong, yes, is absolute poverty. They are living far better off than that of places if you were to look elsewhere in the world. If you were to look at the opposite of Hong Kong, move further away from capitalism in favour of socialism, can he point out any real world examples where socialism has dramatically improved people's material standards of living? You always get these arguments against capitalism because it's just one of these things that they don't look at things on a wider perspective. Everything is on this narrow perspective. Anyway, if you've got any questions you would like to ask, comment in the comments section below. If you've got anything you would like to personally add, again, comment below, and if you like the video, give the video a thumbs up. If you want to share the video, favourite the video, I'd be very grateful for that. And of course, thank you for watching my video, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.